I'd like to welcome you to the third part of our webinar. Um, I'm going to do something that I usually don't do, which is ask for those of you that want to stay. And if my colleagues in the panel are happy to go for an extra 10 minutes, because we got 14 questions, and I don't think that no matter how quickly we do this, we get through them in 7 minutes. So, we plan to then end at 8:10. So let's go to the first question, because we don't have a lot of time, and I'll go by them in order of popularity. The first one has 5 votes, and is from Halad Shamas, and it reads, what is the difference between pseudo-seizures in dissociation? Now, for those of you that don't have a background to this, we've been experiencing this phenomena with many of your Yazidi or Sidi clients in particular, where they seem to have dissociative experiences where they actually faint. And this is why some people have used the name pseudo-seizures. And that's happening, it's actually, been happening quite a lot, particularly in the community, but we also seen this with other groups.
Well, I think one could argue that pseudo-seizures could be explained as a dissociative phenomenon. I think traditionally conversion disorder, as it was once known, or now functional neurological symptoms disorder, it's considered a functional neurological disorder, so there's no neurological pathology identified, and often there may be some meaning to it, although that's by no means always obvious. But as I guess I've tried to explain in the talk today, often these responses are mediated autonomically, there may be a mixture of sympathetic and parasympathetic, or one may dominate the other. But I think, that would be how I would understand dissociative processes as well. So I would tend to see pseudo-seizures as falling in that category. But in the latest DSM, as I also tried to illustrate, there's an emphasis on the state changes, derealization and depersonalization, as exemplifying dissociation. Most clinicians see dissociation as more broadly than that, and many of the other so-called positive dissociative symptoms arguably should also be included under that rubric, because they all involve failures of integration, I think, or effect, they have an effect on integration.
Thank you, Anthony. Unless you want to add something, Tana, I might move to the next question.
Yeah, that's okay.
Which reads, dear panel, thank you for the wonderful presentations. What would be your approach when patients have had history of trauma, but have a reality-based issue, such as lack of family support, social isolation, and stresses of moving to a different place? How do we then help someone when they have unmodifiable issues of reality, especially when they are unready to discuss trauma yet? And that has 8 votes to it.
I don't know if you want to respond, Tiana, because your patient might exemplify this sort of thing in a way.
Yeah. So, like I said, as it was the case with Sam, if they're not ready to discuss trauma, we would certainly not be pushing for that. And definitely, if they are having some practical issues in terms of resettlement, and some of those issues that the question asks, I would definitely be helping client with that first. So part of our work at STARTS is not just clinical, but a lot of, I guess, what we call case management, in terms of linking the clients to all the services, ensuring that that basic sense of safety, whether that be an accommodation or financial or whatever, is there first before we do anything else. in terms of moving through treatment for trauma.
If I could add, perhaps, perhaps with some reference to Sam, it seems to me that you work towards broadening the view of the situation. You're recognizing Sam's strengths, you're recognizing also the reality of trauma, but you're trying to work with the strengths with an understanding of roles and possibilities and potentials. And I think, you were tailoring your treatment. I mean, the fact that he was an athlete, for instance, probably would have particularly suited him to the use of HRV feedback, for instance. He could relate to that, maybe more than some other people. So, you were selectively tailoring your approach to his needs, I would say. And, I think there's at least the beginnings of creating a new narrative. So it's not just a case of recognizing the trauma narrative. At the end of the presentation, we saw that Sam had hope, whereas that was pretty much lacking early on. So there's a new narrative emerging. I don't know if that adds a little to what you said.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's about empowering him, really, more than anything. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question, which is from Elizabeth Tong, and it reads, did you feel that Sam's history of being an athlete and being very in touch with his body helped or hindered in any way his engagement in some of the body-based strategies you use, such as HRV, grounding, and so on?
Definitely helped, especially because with Sam, one of the things was that he wasn't necessarily too much about talking about emotions. He wasn't in tune of this is how I feel. For him, it was very much about the body, how he was feeling physically. So hence why we've taken that approach in terms of let's work on that. Let's work on what you know. Let's work on what sits good and right for you, and then utilizing that to make him overcome some of those things.
Yeah. Again, if I could add a little, I think you've worked in a way that was acceptable to him, as I said, and I get the sense, he's, apart from responding to triggers in his environment, he's also responding to internal cues, isn't he?
Yeah.
Of a physiological kind, but also of an emotional kind.
Yeah.
And as is the case in many cultures, the sense of loss of role and loss of control in his life is pretty significant, and maybe there are strong feelings around fears of loss of emotional control and being exposed as a vulnerable person. One of the things I think that's an important attitude for therapists generally to have is that vulnerability, human vulnerability, is actually a marker of humanity, of value. And even though it's kind of seen as weakness in many cultures, for a therapist, you need to see it as having value so that we can begin to work with it. So, in time, I think he might be able to get a little more in touch with his emotional life.
Yeah, definitely agree with that.
Thank you. Might take you to the next question, which is from Hala Shamas, and it reads, complex trauma, often diagnosed to be borderline personality disorder, DSM have categories which don't fit most of the time the depth of ongoing and ripple effect of trauma that refugees go through. I'd like to have your insight into this matter, please. Tony, would you like to go first?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to. Well, look, I can only agree. And, any kind of checklist form of classification is reductionistic in some ways. It never describes the whole person or the whole experience. It takes time to get to know people and really to understand how they manage and how they struggle and protect themselves. I think sometimes a therapist can really add a felt connection or a felt sense of the journey that they've witnessed. If we are able to truly bear witness, I mean, for all of us, there may be elements of the trauma that are so deep and difficult that we can't completely get it. So I don't think we can ever expect to fully understand the depths of someone's suffering, but humans have a pretty powerful capacity to resonate with each other. You know, I guess I'm trying to highlight here again the felt qualities of connecting and being with someone, and having your difficulties witnessed is a pretty important and powerful part of healing, I think. Leave Tiana to add to that.
Yeah, like I'd just like to add, like at the end of the day, you know, labels, yes, we have them there for a reason, diagnostic criteria and all of that. But at the end of the day, it's the person that we're working with, and it's about how we connect and what that person's needs are and where they're at and where do we meet them. I think that really is what helps them recover and get better.
Thank you. Take you to the next question, which is also very interesting, and it's how do you explore the trauma narrative without deepening the trauma neuropathways or re-traumatizing clients, especially regarding graphic details?
Yeah, I guess one of the, I mean, if I can start again here, if that's okay, but one of the important distinctions I was trying to make is the importance of early trauma. You know, in Sam's case, Tiana, I'll leave you to comment on the nature of his original family relationships. But, you know, sometimes people can have a secure beginning in life or a reasonably secure beginning, and some major trauma or set of traumas occurs that upsets their worldview. You know, they're not, they might say, I'm not the person I was, as Sam said, for instance. On the other hand, if trauma has been severe early in life, they've struggled to develop a coherent worldview in the first place. They've never really had the experience of being a full participant in life. You know, life can feel like simply it's been inflicted, as it were, on one. So, you know, in that case, it's obviously more challenging, and I think it not very helpful to try and construct a story of what isn't there in a way, what's missing. You know, in a sense, the challenge is to create something new. And I think this associational pathway that I've mentioned is a kind of natural, you know, Freud referred to it as primary process, but our minds think in terms of associations. With trauma, of course, a lot of those associations are very difficult. I work in the conversational model, and we're always looking for what's most alive in the person. What can we connect with that actually has some sense of hope rather than simply being destructive or a matter of despair. So there is a real risk of re-traumatization, and I think there is a need, particularly when there's been severe early trauma, for an approach that takes its time. I mean, with Sam, you know, you're still working after a couple of years, I think. You know, it's unpredictable about how long things will take, but certainly treatment policies that foreshorten people's access to treatment do them no favors. And with some people, it is very much a long-term project, I think. But I'll finish there for now.
Anna, would you like to add anything to that?
I'll just briefly, like obviously for Sam, he did identify his early childhood experience as a positive. So he did have that secure or somewhat secure attachment base. And I think that was reflected in terms of how he handled some of the situations prior to 2016. But I've certainly had clients where that wasn't the case, where there was early childhood trauma in addition to refugee trauma, that their presentation was very different. And I probably wouldn't move in the same pace as I did with Sam, simply because it would take a lot more holding the client and helping the client, I guess, develop that safe, like I said, therapeutic alliance with me, and being able to feel comfortable that I'm able to hold the client if we are going to go down the process of trauma processing.
Thank you. If you could add briefly that in my 30 years at STARS, this is something that clinicians always contend with. And one thing that sometimes is useful to remind ourselves is that many of our clients are reliving and therefore strengthening those neural pathways all the time because of, recurrent memories and because, their thoughts go in that direction. So often when we discuss those things in a therapeutic environment, we actually help to reframe and rebuild, different neural pathways associated with those memories.
I think we'd all agree that with each patient, you need to meet them where they are, and you need to work on their agenda. And that's going to look very different. And, some people it'll be very slow. Some people you're going to be quite reluctant to push into sensitive material quickly. Generally sort of being intrusive or pushing isn't the way we want to go. So you want to work with what they're prepared to do and reach some common agreement about an agenda.
Thank you. I might go on to the last question. We're getting very close to time. And with 7 votes, that is, how do you manage countertransference and self-care, especially vicarious trauma? As clinicians, we often care and give and give. What do you do, especially as you work with a lot of emotional pain that people experience, to then go home and care for yourself?
Good question.
I'd like to take this one.
Anthony?
It's a very common theme that we all deal with.
Well, look, the reality is sometimes you do take the work home. I think people that tell you otherwise are probably lying. But, we can say all the common sense things about having other interests and investing in other parts of your life. Family, of course, and all those things are very important. But I tend to think that, for me personally, one thing I'd say is I always like to look forward to my next break. So, once I've had a holiday, I start thinking about the next one. And that's one bit of advice I'd just recommend to all of you.
Thank you, Tony. Taylor?
Well, just adding to what Anthony has already mentioned, a lot of self-care strategies. So really being able to keep those boundaries as much as possible between work and private life. Also, obvious is that sometimes hard to do. A lot of supervision and being able to debrief. And that's one thing I think that, I personally value as a STARS worker, is that after a difficult session, I can actually go out and I can actually debrief with my colleagues. And I find that immensely important because it does help with processing some of that emotional baggage that we do take on from our clients. So supervision, debriefing, self-care.
Thank you, Diana. And of course, that's such a relevant question, particularly today, in these COVID affected times when most of us are working from home and therefore we don't have access to many of the things, that we used to rely on, and we have to be quite creative in terms of finding new ways of communicating with others and getting that support and looking after ourselves. Look, we will need to end here. I'm just going to touch very briefly on a question that's got 6 votes, which reads, is there something similar to STARS available for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are dealing with intergenerational compound and complex trauma? Look, I don't know that, that there is. I think many people work, with that subject. We were approached a few times, by people, from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and that we're thinking of establishing something. And I wish, I think that there is a great need. It's a very different topic. It's a different kind of trauma, and therefore requires, I suppose, a different base of expertise. But certainly, as I'd say to those people, then we'd be very happy to share whatever knowledge, we can contribute to that. And I wish it happens sometimes. I think it's all needed. Now, I'd like to now thank wonderful speakers and presenters and today, and all of you for staying, now 30 minutes after the finishing time. We've had nearly 200 people today, and I think that we still have close to 150 with us at the end, 30 minutes after a usual finishing time. So thank you all so much.